Ahoy and welcome to the Salty Dog, a special segment of the Catholic Men's Podcast, where we tell many a yarn for youngsters. Grab your grog, and we can begin. Reading the story, Pie and Punch, and You Know What's, from Centerburg Tales, by Robert McCloskey. Uncle Ulysses stood near the door of his lunchroom, leaning on his new automatic jukebox. While he peered out across the square toward the lighted windows of the Centerburg Public Library, his face gradually changed from pink to a deep beet red. It turned lavender for a fleeting moment, then faded off into a flickering grassy green color. Uncle Ulysses was not feeling sick, but he'd been changing colors like this for several days now, ever since he'd acquired his beautiful new automatic jukebox. The new jukebox had brilliant lights inside that automatically changed color every few seconds, and anybody or anything that came within 10 feet of the jukebox automatically changed color too. No, Uncle Ulysses was not feeling sick, but he was feeling impatient, and just as he and the jukebox automatically turned lavender for the 17th time, the door opened, and in walked Homer and Freddy. "Hi, Uncle Ulysses," Homer greeted. "Sorry we're late. We picked out a lot of books this evening, because the library is going to be closed for 2 weeks." "The librarian is going away on a vacation," Freddy explained, "so we picked out enough books to last until she comes back." "I heard she was going to Yellowstone Park with the 6th grade teacher," said Uncle Ulysses, who kept pretty close track of things like that. "Yep," said Homer, "and she promised to send us a postcard with a picture of Old Faithful on it." "That'll be nice," said Uncle Ulysses, listening politely. Then he said, "Boys, I'm going over to the barber shop for a spell, so you two fellows help yourself to donuts and look after things while I'm gone." "Okay, Uncle Ulysses," Homer said, and then he watched patiently while Uncle Ulysses went from one of his automatic gadgets to the next, first turning them on and then turning them off, just to make sure they would stop. It was a slight nervous habit that Uncle Ulysses had developed of late, and it seemed to be more noticeable right before he planned to leave Homer in charge of the lunchroom. He checked them off one by one. Waffle irons, toaster, donut machine, dishwasher. Last of all, he walked over to check his new automatic jukebox. He gave it an affectionate pat. It was a pink pat, because the automatic lights happened to be pink at the moment. He punched a button to select a number called Boogie Woogie Symphony, and dropped a nickel, a green one, into the green slot of the jukebox. There was a click, and mysteriously and silently, the record that Uncle Ulysses had selected slid out of a large stack and began to spin. "Golly," said Freddy, "it seems almost like magic." Uncle Ulysses smiled orangely, and they all three stood entranced, listening to the beautiful, full-bodied tones of a Boogie Woogie Symphony orchestra. "It almost seems to hypnotize you," Homer exclaimed as he listened to the music and watched the record spin and the lights shift slowly from one color to another. Uncle Ulysses nodded proudly, and as the music ended on an odd minor boogie-woogie note, he watched tensely while some mysterious automatic fingers inside the jukebox silently slipped the record back into the stack. "There," he said, visibly relieved. "That works perfectly, and it stops perfectly. Here are a couple of nickels, boys. You can have some music while I'm gone." Homer and Freddy thanked Uncle Ulysses, and after he had gone off to the barber shop, they sat silently for some moments, watching the colored lights inside the jukebox slowly change from one color to another. "Ha!" Freddy looked at Homer and smiled weakly. "You sure look funny sitting over there in that green light." "Ha yourself," Homer answered. "You don't look so hot either, especially when you're turning blue all over. Come on, Freddy, have a donut, and let's look at our library books." Homer and Freddy had finished their donuts and were trying to decide which books to read first and which to save until last, when a stranger opened the door and stalked into the lunchroom. "Good evening," he said softly, brandishing a flat parcel and turning slowly from rosy pink to deep purple, along with the parcel and the lights in the jukebox. "I have brought a recording to put in your jukebox," he said, furiously fumbling with the strings and paper of his parcel. "It will be number 1 on the bit—" The stranger broke off suddenly and stood quietly in the corner in order to change colors and to compose himself. Homer and Freddy changed colors too, while they watched and waited silently. Then the stranger, having calmed down to some extent, repeated, "It will be number 1 on the hit parade." He finished undoing his package and produced a recording, which he carelessly tossed almost to the ceiling. Then he stood motionless, his arms dangling limp at his sides, watching it drop. The record landed with a crash on the lunchroom floor. Homer and Freddy gasped, and the stranger laughed. "Unbreakable," he said, chuckling. He picked up the record and bent it almost double. "Absolutely, disgustingly unbreakable. I've tried to break it. Goodness knows I've tried," he said, as though he were apologizing to Homer and Freddy. He then turned purposefully and unlocked the glass front of the jukebox. "I'll put it right here between Boogie Woogie Symphony and Boogie Woogie Polka," he said, sliding the record into the stack. Then he quickly snapped the glass case shut and locked it with a flourish. "There," he said with great relief and a slight change of hue. "That's that." The two boys felt relieved too. They had gotten over being startled by the sudden appearance of this odd stranger. Homer, remembering his job, put down the book he had been holding and went behind the counter. "Would you care for a snack to eat, sir? A sandwich and a cup of coffee?" he asked. "Some nice fresh dough—" "Ut! The stranger interrupted, wagging his finger violently before Homer could finish saying donuts. "I never eat them," he confided. Then, leaning way over, he whispered, "They're positively full of holes, you know. They're simply full of holes." Homer thought about that for a moment and then shrugged his shoulders. "How about a piece of pie, sir?" he asked pleasantly. "Oh me, oh my," the stranger gasped. "I never eat he hiccuped. "I never eat pie because the very thought of pie makes me hiccup." Homer quickly filled a glass with water and handed it to the stranger. "Hold your breath and count to 10 while you drink this," he commanded, and the stranger meekly did as he was told. "That always cures my hiccups," Homer explained. "It cures my hiccups too," said Freddy, "but I don't get 'em from thinking about sputtered the stranger, waving an arm wildly and almost dropping the glass. He looked reproachfully at Freddy and then turned to Homer. "Thank you, young man, for curing my hiccups. I must go now. I really must be going," he said, turning toward the door. He appeared anxious to be gone before something dreadful could happen. "Hey, mister," Freddy called. "You forgot to put a name for the new record here next to the selector buttons." "Oh," said the stranger, pausing with his hand on the door. "It hasn't any name. It's, just one of those things. And by the way," he added, "don't play it. I beg of you to never set needle to its black, unbreakable surface, and never let its sounds escape from this beautiful, gaudy jukebox." The stranger paused while Homer and Freddy nodded and gulped. Suddenly, without the least trace of humor, the stranger laughed. "Ha ha ha!" and changed to a lovely shade of blue-green. "But you will," he whispered, taking on an amethyst tinge. "Now good night, my proud parturient pair of panted Pandoras." Then the door closed, ever so grass-green and softly. "That character," said Freddy after a long silence, "could make some little squirrel very happy. What did he mean, Homer, when he called us a proud parturient pair of panted Pandoras? A Pandora is an animal, isn't it? Why did that screwball call us a couple of proud animals with pants on?" "You're thinking of Panda, Freddy," said Homer. but Pandora is a girl's name." "He called us girls?" cried Freddy, doubling his fists in frustration. "Now how's that for a character? He calls you a girl with words over your word level." "He didn't exactly call us girls, Freddy," Homer said thoughtfully. "At least, not just any old kind of girl. Pandora was somebody famous, like Pocahontas or Molly Pitcher. Seems as though I've read something about her doing something very special, but I can't remember what. We have to find out exactly what this Dame Pandora did before we'll know exactly what he meant. It might be a sort of clue, Freddy, and that word parturient. Maybe we ought to find out what that means." "I'll match you, Freddy, to see who runs over to the library to look 'em up," Homer suggested, producing a nickel from a pocket of his blue jeans and giving it an expert flip. "Okay," Freddy agreed, producing his nickel and flipping it too. "They're both heads," said Homer when they had uncovered their coins. "So you have to look 'em up, Freddy." "Well, all right, if you think it's absolutely necessary, Homer, but I still think the guy was nuts. I'll look up parturient in the dictionary, but where will I look to find out about that Pandora dame?" "She might be in the dictionary too," Homer said, "but if she isn't there, you'll have to ask the librarian where to find her." "All that trouble to find out about some silly dame," said Freddy disgustedly. Then he grumbled something about screwballs in general and went scuffing out the door, muttering, "Proud parturient pair of panted Pandoras. Cripes! The guy must have had peas for supper." "Did you get the dope, Freddy?" Homer asked expectantly when Freddy came scuffling back into the lunchroom. "Yeah," said Freddy, assuming the look of a martyr because of all the mental effort he had just put forth. "She was a dame, and she had a box that she wasn't supposed to open the lid of or let anything out of, and she did. And what came out was a lot of some kind of trouble things that must be extinct by now because the whole thing happened such a long time ago. And parturient," Freddy continued, "means just about to let something out. So you see, Homer, first he tells us not to, then he tells us we will, then he tells us we shouldn't, and then the screwball says we're parturient and just about to. The guy was nuts, Homer. I'll flip you to see who plays the record first." "Well," said Homer doubtfully, "maybe we better not until Uncle Ulysses comes back anyway." "Shucks, Homer, what can happen from playing a record?" Freddy demanded. "All that can happen is it can sound awful or something like that, and we can be ready to put our hands over our ears just in case." Homer still looked doubtful, so Freddy said, "Grown-ups are always funny like that anyway, Homer. You know that. They tell you not to listen to murders on the radio, and then give you a radio for Christmas. They tell you not to read comics, and then they sell 'em like hotcakes. The 6th grade teacher says, 'No gentlemen chews bubble gum,' and her old man sells about 100 sticks a day in his candy store. I don't see why you should be afraid to play—" "I'm not afraid to play it," Homer interrupted hotly, because his pride had been hurt. He jammed his hand into his pocket and jerked out his nickel. Then he marched straight up to the jukebox, poked one of the buttons, the button, the one without a name, and jammed his nickel into the slot. There was a loud click, and mysteriously and silently, the disgustingly unbreakable record slid out of the stack and began to spin. Both Homer and Freddy watched out of the corners of their eyes, wondering what kind of a weird noise or music or even a scream might come blaring out of the jukebox. They stood, poised, hands ready to clap over their ears, prepared to dash out of the door. As the music began flowing out of the jukebox, they sighed with relief and began to smile. It was only a happy little tune with a bouncing rhythm. "That's sure a surprise," said Homer, happily changing colors and nodding his head in time with the music. "There's nothing wrong with that music," said Freddy, beginning to tap his foot. "Golly, that's a catchy tune." After a few more measures of the catchy rhythm, a song began coming out of the jukebox. "Sing hi diddle diddle for a silly little viddle, sing git gat giddle, got a hole in the middle, sing do-de do-do, there's dough, you know, there's not no nuts in you-know-whats. In a whole donut there's a nice whole hole, when you take a big bite, hold the whole hole tight. If a little bit bitten or a great bit bitten. Any hole with a hole bitten in it is a holy hole, and it just plain isn't. After a few final measures of the catchy music, the record stopped playing. Freddy cried, "That's about the best tune I've ever heard, Homer, and the words are sort of good too. I'm going to play that record again." Freddy deposited his nickel in the jukebox, and once more he and Homer nodded and tapped time to the tricky music and listened to the tricky words. Before the song was halfway through, they were singing gaily along with the voice coming from the jukebox. In a whole donut there's a nice hole. When you take a big bite, hold the hole tight. If a little bit bitten or a great bit bitten, any hole with a hole bitten in it is a holy hole, and it just plain isn't. There just plain isn't anything wrong with that record, said Homer. Nah, said Freddy. The guy was nuts, like you know what's. Freddy giggled and hummed a few measures of the catchy tune. I could sit around, said Homer, for a holy whole day and not do a thing but listen to it play. Say, Homer, said Freddy, starting to laugh, do you know what's? You're talking a little bit funny. Ha, Homer grinned at Freddy. You're talking notes, just like music, and a little bit bitten funny too. That's not nothing, Freddy started to sing, to get a little excited about? No, not a bit bitten, Homer agreed. Not a little bit bitten, Freddy sang. Or a great bit bitten, Homer joined in. And any hole with a hole bitten in it is a holy hole, and it just plain isn't. They ended up singing as loud as they could sing and stamping time with their feet. That was just plain swell, Freddy sang happily when they had finished. But Freddy, Homer sang sadly, we're a little bit bitten. Or a great bit Freddy stopped singing suddenly, and the smile faded slowly from his face. Holy smoke, he sang forte. Yes, holy smoke, Homer encored in a pathetic piano. The barber put down the cards he had been dealing to Uncle Ulysses, Posty Pratt, and the mayor. He answered the telephone, listened for a minute, and then called over his shoulder. Pipe down for a minute, you guys. Got a bad connection or something. Oh, Homer, it's you, he said, finally recognizing Homer's voice. Yes, he's here. I'll call him to the phone. He jerked his thumb at Ulysses. Homer's on the line. Says you better gittle back to the lunchroom. Funny thing, the barber continued. Sounds just as though you were singing. Hello, Homer, said Uncle Ulysses. What? What's that you're singing? He listened attentively for a while, and then asked anxiously, But the jukebox stops playing and singing, doesn't it? Oh, well, said Uncle Ulysses soothingly as he regained his smile. That's nothing to worry a bit bitten about. For a minute I thought that the jukebox couldn't stop. Say, Homer, that's a good number you're singing, Uncle Ulysses said. Sing it just once more, please, from the beginning. Uncle Ulysses, with the receiver pressed tight to his ear, stood swaying and tapping time with one foot, then with 2 feet, and then he started singing, In a whole donut there's a nice hole. When you take a big bite, hold the hole tight. If a little bit bitten or a great bit bitten, any hole with a hole bitten in it is a holy hole, and it just plain isn't. Thank you, Homer, that was just plain swell, Uncle Ulysses complimented with a cadenza. Then he sang goodbye and turned to the barber, the mayor, and Posty Pratt, singing, Drop your cards and get all set. This song is swell for a male quartet. And it certainly was a swell song for a male quartet. After about 3 practice tries, they rendered it in perfect 4-part harmony. They sang it a little bit bitten better every time they sang it the holy whole way through. By the time that Uncle Ulysses and Posty Pratt discovered that they could not stop singing first and second tenor, and the mayor and the barber discovered that they couldn't stop singing alto and bass, they had already set a non-stop record for barbershop quartetting. Finally, 4 desperate men burst out of the barbershop in the closest of close harmony and went singing off in all directions. When Uncle Ulysses came high-diddle-diddling through the door of the lunchroom, he created a minor discord until he started singing in the same key as Homer and Freddy and about 24 or so after the movie customers. The customers, when they had first arrived in the lunchroom, had been very much taken by the charming little melody with the clever words that Homer and Freddy kept singing over and over again. One by one, they too had joined in, and one by one, they too had discovered that they could not stop singing the charming little melody with the clever words. The soprano from the church was hitting A flat above high C and giving out with a git-gat-gittle that made every piece of glassware in the lunchroom vibrate and tingle. She was being well supported with do-de-do-do from a full mixed chorus of male and female voices of all ages, not to mention all colors, thanks to the jukebox and its tastefully contrived lights. Never before had there been such a happy and carefree, downright enchanting song being sung by such a puzzled, downright unhappy gathering of people. Homer was singing and singing along with everybody else in the lunchroom. He was trying and trying along with everybody else to forget the clever little words and the charming little melody. He tried singing another song, Mary had a little victual, and couldn't git-gat-gittle past the very first line before he was right back do-de-do-doing at the very top of his lungs. He looked anxiously around him at the faces of some of the more experienced singers, the soprano, the deacon, the dentist, and Uncle Ulysses, all people who had been singing for years and years and could be more or less depended upon to sing in the proper key. They could always be depended upon to stop when they came to the end of the song, too. But not tonight. Tonight, they couldn't even slow down, let alone stop. What if we never stop? Homer began to worry. Somebody has to think of a cure, he thought, so he began to think just as hard as his poor young song and rhythm-racked mind could think. He remembered that something like this had happened to him once before. It was last September, when he had read a verse in a library book and couldn't stop repeating it. He remembered that there was a cure in the story. Now if he could only recall the name of that book or the name of that story. Several times during the past hour he had been ever so close to remembering, but then suddenly he was caught up again in the catchy rhythm of the jukebox song. Homer looked at the clock and saw that it was 9:05. In 5 minutes, the library would close for 2 weeks. We just got to find that book right away, Homer thought. We just got to git-gat-gittle that book from the library no matter what. He waited for a moment until the soprano finished off a particularly high and ear-piercing passage, then jumped on the counter and soloed, "Everybody follow me over to the library." The soprano, having the loudest voice, spoke, or rather sang, for the entire group. "We will follow Homer Price. He can help us, ain't that nice?" And they all danced out of the door after Homer, singing, "Hi diddle diddle for a silly little victual," and on and on and on. It was closing time, and the librarian had just finished counting 31 pennies in fines from overdue books. She glanced quickly around the library to see if there was any last-minute thing to attend to before she locked the door and went off on her vacation. She glanced thoughtfully down the neat shelves of books. Then she looked at the carefully stacked periodicals and made a quick mental note to renew the subscription to the Musical Monthly as soon as she returned. Then she closed the big dictionary that Freddy had left open so dust wouldn't settle on the page of peas during the next 2 weeks. At last everything was as neat as a pin. Every chair and table was placed just so, and every last book was resting in its proper place on its proper shelf. Now, she thought happily, I can go on my vacation. This is the moment I've been waiting for. And that was the moment that Homer danced diddly-viddly in through the vestibule and crash, tripped over the standing sign that said, "Quiet, please." The soprano hit high A flat right on the nose as she fell on top of him, followed by a mixed quartet, a trio, a couple of septets, a few odd stray singers, and Freddy, who had not much previous musical experience. Before this heap of melody had untangled itself completely, the mare crescendoed into Uncle Ulysses' well-padded musical coda. Then the judge, a couple of city councilmen, and the dog warden sang in next, all dancing in an appropriate, dignified manner. Posty Pratt sang his way in at the head of his family of wife, daughters, sons-in-law, 8 grandchildren, and an elderly cousin of Mrs. Pratt's, who was having herself a high old time keeping time with her cane. Homer wiggled to his feet and danced straight for the librarian. "We're a little bit bitten," he sang, and the entire group chorused, "A little bit bitten or a great bit bitten." They sang the whole song for her, better than they had ever sung it. It really did sound wonderful, and it certainly showed what a little practice can accomplish. The librarian could not help but be impressed with such beautiful singing, but after listening to 3 or 4 renditions, she began to worry about catching her train, and tried to ease people politely toward the door. When she began to have an irresistible urge to sing too, she began to understand the unhappy predicament of all of these forlorn souls who were singing such a happy and carefree little song. "What can I do to help?" whimpered the librarian, trying her utmost not to sing the question. "There's a book here on the shelves that'll tell us how to cure ourselves," Homer soloed. "What's the title?" yelled the librarian, losing complete control of her library manner. "Do you know the author's name? What's the book's catalog number?" she screamed. "Do-de-do-do, I do not know," sang Homer. "Those things I cannot remember, but I read it last September." "Then there's nothing I can do, Git-gat-gittle. I can't help you," the librarian chanted, beginning to be a wee bit bitten herself. "We have to find a black-backed book, or maybe it's a brown-backed book," sang Homer, "and I think it was a little bit battered." Then everybody, the poor librarian included, joined in, singing, "Find a black-backed book that's a little bit battered, or a brown-backed book that's a little bit battered." And at the same time, everybody, the poor librarian included, started dancing past the shelves, snatching out every single brown-backed and black-backed book they came to. "Do-de-do-do, there's dough, you know, there's not no nuts in you-know-whats." They all sang as they danced back and forth and in and out among the shelves of books. They started carrying an endless stream of brown-backed and black-backed books to where Homer was dancing and singing on the largest reading room table. To most of these, which were the wrong shade of brown, or too thin or too fat, or too battered or too new, he just sang, "No!" or shook his head in time with the music. The books that Homer rejected were tossed in a disorderly heap that brought tears to the eyes and a sob to the contralto voice of the librarian. Any books that looked about right as to size, color, or amount of battering, Homer quickly thumbed through to see if he could find the story that he was sure would cure them of their terrible affliction. "In a whole donut there's a nice whole hole," everybody was singing and then singing some more. The volume would gradually diminish as voices tired, and then someone's eye would light on a letter O, or a number 800, and burst out again with a loud, "Holy ho ho!" and that was enough to set everybody off at full blast again. They just couldn't stop singing the silly little song. The more they sang, the more they danced past the shelves. The more they danced past the shelves, the more books they collected. And before very long, Homer was perched in the middle of a tremendous pile of brown-backed and black-backed books that were a little bit battered, more or less. There were books of art and biography, history and literature, philosophy, geography, geology, philology, zoology, and even economics. But Homer still hadn't found the book that he remembered reading last September. He courageously kept on looking, and everybody else kept on singing and dancing past the shelves and bringing more and more books. Freddy started dancing precariously along the balcony, and books started sailing over the railing to Homer, who caught them expertly to the tune of "Hi diddle diddle for a silly little fiddle," without skipping a single beat in the rhythm. Suddenly, the books that Freddy was lobbing from the balcony started sailing right on past Homer, because Homer was giving his undivided attention to a story in a slightly battered brown-backed book. Almost before you could sing Tom Robinson, everybody had gathered in a rhythmically swaying group around the base of the mountainous pile of books. "Git, gat, giddle's got a story in the middle," Uncle Ulysses sang hopefully in his tired tenor. Suddenly, Homer stopped swaying and bobbing. He smiled and kept reading, and then he started to sway and bob again. But while everybody else was swaying, Homer was bob-bobbing, and when others bobbed, Homer swayed. Homer was caught by a new rhythm, all his own. Then, from the top of the pile of books, he began to shout at the top of his voice, "Conductor, when you receive a fare, punch in the presence of the passenger. A blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare, a buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink trip slip for the 3-cent fare. Punch in the presence of the passenger. Punch, brothers, punch with care. Punch in the presence of the passenger." Before Homer started shouting the second chorus of "Punch, brothers, punch with care," the singers began to falter in their rhythm for the first time that evening. Then one by one they began to shout along with Homer, "A pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare," until everybody, yes, everybody, began to stamp his tired feet for joy and shout, "Punch, brothers, punch with care. Punch in the presence of the passenger." That is, everybody except Homer. He sat smiling and out of breath on his perch atop the pile of books. Everybody else was yelling, "Punch, brothers, punch," and stamping so hard that the chandelier shook. The few red and blue and yellow books that remained on the shelves shook. Even the "Quiet, Please" sign shook and rocked on its legs to the rhythm of the stamping. But not Homer. Homer was cured. After he had rested for a moment and caught his breath, he slid unobserved down the pile of books. "A blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare," everybody was shouting and stamping so loud and so hard that Homer was completely ignored. He dodged expertly through the group without being stamped on, receiving only a light unintentional clip from the cane of Mrs. Pratt's elderly second cousin. Homer needed somebody to help complete the cure, anybody who had not yet heard the Punch Brothers Punch jingle. He rushed out of the door to bring back the very first person he should meet. The chances were 102 to 1 that it wouldn't be the person it was. There were at least 102 Cinderburg citizens who were not inside the library, but there she was, coming right up the library steps. It was the 6th grade teacher. "What has happened to Lucy?" she cried, referring to the librarian. "It's almost train time." "You've got to help," Homer said. "Come inside so they can tell you." As they came in through the door, Homer shouted as he had never shouted before. "Tell it to her!" he bellowed, pointing to the 6th grade teacher. And they told her, "Punch, brothers, punch with care. Punch in the presence of the passenger." They very generously told her 2 times all the way through, without holding back a single punch or pink trip slip. Like all 6th grade teachers, she was very quick to catch on. Caught it good and perfect. "A blue trip slip for an 8-cent fare, a buff trip slip for a 6-cent fare, a pink trip slip for a 3-cent fare. Punch in the presence of the passenger." Then, as suddenly as they had started shouting and stamping out the jingle, everybody stopped, just as Homer knew they would. Everybody, that is, except the 6th grade teacher. She'd caught it just too perfect, and she went right on shouting and stamping. Everybody else sat down, gasping for breath, right where they were, to rest their tired and aching feet. Freddy, being young, recovered his wind quickly and edged his way over to where Homer stood. "Now what," he asked, nodding at the howling, stamping 6th grade teacher, "are we going to do with her?" "She'll be all right," Homer said confidently, "as soon as she tells it to somebody else. Just like I was cured when I told it to you, and you were cured when you told it to her." You mean to tell me that after you tell that jingle to somebody, you forget it and are cured? Freddy asked. Yep, that's the way it goes, said Homer, just like in the book. Freddy thought for a moment and then asked, and the person she tells it to has to tell it to somebody else? Yep, Freddy, somebody's always going to be saying it, Homer admitted. Gets to be monotonous, doesn't it, Homer? Freddy commented, shaking his head sadly toward the 6th grade teacher who was just beginning another chorus. It'll be terrible to have to listen to somebody around town keep on saying and saying that jingle forever and ever. That'll be better than having everybody in Centerburg keep on singing forever and ever, Homer argued. And besides, he continued, she's going on vacation, isn't she? We'll just have to make sure that she gets on that train without telling somebody, and all our troubles will be over. Come on, Freddy, we gotta get busy. The two boys went around rousing everybody, making them put on their shoes and explaining what had to be done about the poor teacher. The mayor acted at once. While lacing his shoes, he appointed a committee of the 2 councilmen and the dog warden to collect baggage and to see the librarian and the teacher to the train. Everybody filed out of the library. The librarian turned out the lights on the still swaying chandelier and locked the door on the shambles of her Dewey Decimal System. She helped lead the helplessly reciting teacher to a waiting car, and they were whisked away to catch the train. Golly, Uncle Ulysses, Homer said, suddenly remembering, nobody has been looking after the lunchroom for a whole hour. By jingo, Uncle Ulysses snapped his fingers. You'd better run right on back there, Homer. I've got a little matter to talk over with the barber and the mayor. Are you coming too, Posty? He asked the postmaster. Mrs. Pratt frowned, and Posty sheepishly said, no, and marched away home at the head of his family. Uncle Ulysses, the barber, and the mayor headed for the barber shop, and the soprano and all the others walked off on their tired and aching feet. We were awfully lucky, Homer, that somebody hadn't borrowed that book from the library, Freddy said as they settled down once more with their books. We'd be singing yet. Homer nodded thoughtfully and didn't answer. What's the name of that book? Freddy demanded. It's a book of stories by Mark Twain, Homer replied. He's the same guy that wrote Tom Sawyer and Life on the Mississippi and a lot of other good stories. It's sure a good book to know about, Freddy commented. In case you ever need it again, you know just what to ask for. Say, Homer, how did that jingle go? I can't remember, Freddy, Homer said. That's the kind of jingle it is. You can't stop saying it until you tell it to somebody else, and then you forget all about it. I wish I'd thought to write the jingle down on a piece of paper and keep it handy. It's like you said, Freddy, a guy might need a jingle like that in a terrible hurry sometime, and it could save an awful lot of trouble. I'll help you copy it, Homer, Freddy offered, just as soon as the librarian gets back from Yellowstone Park. Why, hello, Sheriff, Homer greeted as the sheriff walked in the door. Where have you been all evening? He asked, remembering that the sheriff had not been part of the strange singing and reciting. Over to the state capitol, the sheriff said, nodding his greetings. I was attending a meeting. I'm hungry, Homer. How about a cup of coffee and a piece of apple pie? Sure thing, Sheriff, Homer said. Freddy, you start some fresh coffee while I get the pie. Both boys were hustling around behind the counter when they heard a click that made their hair stand on end. When they turned, there was the sheriff, all grass green and smiling, standing next to the jukebox, with his coin purse still in his hand. What one are you playing? Freddy yelled, making a quick end run around the counter to look. It's, said Freddy in a terrified voice as he watched the disgustingly unbreakable record slide out of the stack. Then Freddy sighed with relief and changed to a brighter shade of lavender as the magic-like machinery quickly and silently flipped the record over. Golly, that was a close call, cried Freddy. For a moment I thought... Then a happy and lilting little melody began pouring out of the jukebox. That's Nighty Mice music, the sheriff said, beginning to nod in time with the melody. and then the song began flowing out. A hip-high hippopotamus said hips and lips make most of us. From tip to tip, a 5-foot lip. From hip to tip, a 3-foot foot. With 3-foot feet, our 4 feet meet the ground, so we won't tip a bit. I bet you never yet have met a tippy-lippy, hip-high hippopotamus. Homer, Freddy gulped. We got to get a hold of that book. The one by the guy that wrote Tom Sawyer and Life on the Mississippi. Homer interrupted violently. Don't say the name of that river. Then he, right away, as fast as he could, filled 2 glasses with water. The 2 boys solemnly held their breath and counted to 10 and drank the water down. There, said Freddy, smiling once more. That always cures makes them go away. I guess the whole thing was just our imaginations, eh, Homer? Yeah, Freddy, said Homer. We must have just dreamed the whole thing. Then, as the music coming from the jukebox ended with a spasmodic chord, Homer turned to the sheriff and said, Sheriff, here's your piece of pie. The end of Pie and Punch and You Know What's. Thank you all so much for listening to this story and my terrible rendition of these songs, and I wish you all fair winds and following seas. Godspeed. And that was the moment that Homer danced diddly-viddly in. Oh, man. And that was the moment that Homer danced diddly-did.